Hello and welcome to another episode of Reviews Redux, where I take another look at one of my older reviews and bring it up to my more current quality standards. Today I'm taking another look at Far Cry 2, specifically the Fortunes Edition, which was a re-release of the game with some additional content, and it was available for PC, Xbox 360, and PlayStation 3, with the version you're seeing here being the PC version. This is a first-person shooter, and while it is the second main entry in the Far Cry series, it's technically the fourth game in it, because you also had Instincts and Vengeance that came out between the original Far Cry and this. But those were console-exclusive spin-off games, so they don't really count in that regard. At any rate, this was developed by Ubisoft as opposed to Crytek, and it was released in 2008 for PC, Xbox 360, and PlayStation 3, with the PC version generally being considered the most superior, not just because it was much more technologically advanced than the console versions, but it also had things like being able to save anywhere as opposed to only being able to save at save points. But despite the PC version generally being considered the best version of the game, it has its own fair share of problems, some of which were present on the game's original release, and some of which have been introduced over time as hardware has improved and the frame rates have gotten higher. Regardless of technical issues, however, the game was generally very well received across the board when it came out, but interestingly enough, when Far Cry 3 was announced and shown off, it was shown to be a very different game from Far Cry 2, and ever since then, the Far Cry franchise has stuck with that gameplay style and not really done a whole lot with things that Far Cry 2 did. In fact, about the only things that remain intact that were introduced in Far Cry 2 are the Dunya engine, which has been built upon ever since, the way brush fires will spread, although it hasn't really been replicated quite like Far Cry 2 ever since this game was released, as well as the fact that it is an open world game, and the healing system. Everything else introduced in Far Cry 2 or heavily modified in Far Cry 2 has since been heavily modified if it has been kept at all in subsequent games. So you can more or less think of this as the bridge between the original Far Cry, which was a completely different style of first-person shooter than what we know as the Far Cry series to this day, and the modern interpretation of the Far Cry series. But what about Far Cry 2 itself? Is it a gem that still holds up, or is it something else entirely? Well, let's go ahead and start delving right into it and find out. And like always, we'll go ahead and start with the presentation, which runs on the, at the time, brand new Dunya engine, which started off as CryEngine, and as Ubisoft continued developing it, it basically became its own thing, went off in its own direction. And while it certainly looks rather dated by modern standards, especially with regards to the texture quality and the modeling and animations, there are certain aspects of the engine that still hold up rather well, like the physics and most notably, the flame propagation, which did carry over into subsequent Far Cry games, but it wasn't quite as impressive in those as it was in Far Cry 2, and it actually remains impressive to this day just how quickly and devastating the brush fires in this game can be. You'll set fire to the brush through either a Molotov or even just an explosive like a grenade or something like that, and it will spread extremely quickly and suddenly take over basically the entire area. And while the capabilities of the Dunya engine did improve over time as subsequent Far Cry games got made and released, that feature still never managed to impress us quite as much as it does in Far Cry 2, even to this day. But while that in particular deserves praise, there are also certain aspects of the engine which weren't really a problem when the game released, but have actually become problems later on. Things like tying certain aspects of it to frame rate, requiring you to actually limit the frame rate on modern hardware because the modern hardware runs it at higher than 60 frames per second, and if the game runs higher than 60 frames per second, it tends to completely freak out. Physics will glitch out, audio cues won't play correctly, the NPCs will just constantly spaz out. It's an absolute mess if this thing runs over 60 frames per second. Thankfully, that's not a difficult problem to fix, but it is still something you need to be aware of. Another thing you need to be aware of is that the game released in 2008, which means that it was right in the middle of the obsession that generation had over brown and gray and realistic color schemes, which in this particular case translates to basically every single thing in this game being a shade of brown. Because there's not even really much gray in this game, it's just mostly brown. And there's a bit of green here and there when you get to areas that are more jungle, but the colors are so washed out you can barely even tell that they're green. And this means that regardless of how much the visuals hold up from a quality standpoint, the game ends up just looking bland and ugly to the point where it actually starts to wear on you after a while, and that while isn't very long into the game. And it certainly doesn't help that on top of all of that, it has a reduced FOV, so where on a widescreen monitor you want a minimum of 90 degrees, or in my case I'd prefer to have it around 100 to 110 degrees, but the default in this is 75 degrees, which is not quite as terrible as most other console shooters, which are usually somewhere between 50 and 65 degrees, which very quickly induces nausea. 75 at least doesn't quickly induce nausea, but it does do that over time, and it does result in headaches pretty early on. Obviously, your mileage may vary a bit depending on how susceptible you are to FOV, but even if you aren't necessarily susceptible to FOV, you might be susceptible to the motion blur, which is extremely intense in this game, particularly when you try to sprint. So I'm not entirely sure what they were thinking in the FOV and the effects regard, but it does end up being pretty obnoxious after a while. And all of that screams that not only are the visuals dated very heavily to 2008, when some of those things were still being figured out, but it means that the visuals not only don't hold up all that well, even though there are certain features of the engine that do, but it really means that the visuals actively interfere with your ability to play the game. Thankfully, the sound design doesn't really have that problem, apart from some weird glitches that you might experience, but once you get past the rather solid music that has a very distinct African vibe to it and fits the game extremely well, you find that the rest of the sound really suffers quite a lot. The gun and explosion sounds are kind of all over the place. Some of the gun sounds are okay, and the explosion sounds are okay, but none of it really has a really nice bass kick to it, and for a lot of the weapons, they sound almost stock. So that's an unfortunate missed opportunity there, but the real problem is in the voice acting, where every single character in this game sounds almost completely disinterested in what they're doing. Maybe it's different in other languages, but in English they speak all of their lines very quickly and without any emotion whatsoever. And that's assuming you can even hear them in the first place, because most of the time it sounds like they're mumbling and you can barely hear what they're actually saying, even with the volume cranked all the way up.
Got it? Hit the oasis, kill the guards, use your mobile to send us the location. It's gonna be good.
But it doesn't really matter, because the only thing you're really going to be paying attention to when you're actually playing the game are when people are issuing callouts, and that clues you in on where they are and what they might be doing. So when you bring all of that sound design together, it is at very best an extremely mixed bag, and most of the time it's actually subpar to downright weak. Meanwhile, the visuals were really impressive for 2008 as far as visual quality goes and such, especially on console, but they haven't really aged all that well, and in some cases they outright get in your way while you're playing, so it ends up being kind of a mess in terms of presentation. But of course, as messy as the presentation can be, what really matter here are the story and the gameplay. The story in this starts out by having you pick one of several different mercenaries that you can play as, and regardless of which one you pick, the others have a chance of appearing in your game as NPCs, with the so-called buddy system, which I'll get to more in a moment. Once you've made your selection, you are dropped into the first cutscene where you have arrived in-country in an unnamed African nation that has completely fallen apart at this point, and you are being driven to the town of Pala by a taxi driver who gives you a bit of a rundown on what the situation in country is while you're driving into town. On the way into town, you start suffering the effects of disease and come to find out shortly thereafter that you are suffering from malaria. And while you're laying bedridden in town, the object of your mission arrives to gloat at you. Your target is the Jackal, an arms dealer whose weapons have been arming both sides in this incredibly bloody and miserable conflict, and whoever your employer is wants the Jackal dead, except that's not really going to work out all that well when you're laying in bed with malaria, and the Jackal is right there gloating at you, quoting Nietzsche, acting like he is the smartest man in the universe. And herein lies the first major problem with the story of Far Cry 2. The main villain. Now, villains have become one of the main features of the Far Cry series and games subsequent to this, but the Jackal is certainly no Voss, or even Pagan Min, or Joseph Seed, or even the sisters that were in Far Cry New Dawn, or even Hoyt, that one guy in Far Cry 3 that basically everybody forgot existed because Voss was just so much cooler. No, the Jackal is basically impossible to take seriously, partly because every single time he shows up, you can't do a thing about it because for whatever reason you have been disabled at the particular moment he finds you. He'll mumble something stupid in an attempt at being philosophical or sounding much smarter than he actually is, and then he'll just wander off. And that's only at certain very specific parts of the storyline when the game ultimately decides, you know what, we need to railroad you into something. For the rest of the game, he's just somebody in the background, not even really doing much nefarious. I mean, yeah, he's an arms dealer and he's arming the conflict, but as a character, he barely even has a presence, and what presence exists is really no different from that one asshole you know, because you know somebody who is like this, who discovered Nietzsche, read a few lines without even remotely considering what Nietzsche was actually trying to say, and then just suddenly thinks they have the entire world figured out, when in reality all they're doing is using Nietzsche to try to justify being an asshole.
You know, there's a book I read a long time ago. Still think about it every day. Helps me understand life out here. The book talks about men, about what motivates them. Simple, really. A living being seeks above all else to discharge its strength. Life itself is will to power. Nothing else matters.
So sure, the game gives you ample motivation for wanting to trebuchet the dude into the sun, but that's not really a substitute for an actually good villain. And the effect this has on the story is basically something it can't recover from, because in order to get to the Jackal, you have to play both sides of the conflict, the UFLL and the APR, and they will sort of kind of help you get closer, even though it is painfully obvious right from the beginning that they are only using you for their own ends, and it doesn't really matter what you're doing because you're never really making any real progress. In fact, the entire story is basically built to confirm this sort of nihilistic viewpoint that absolutely nothing you do matters. It doesn't matter if you take down the Jackal, it doesn't matter if the UFLL or APR win, it doesn't matter if you even survive all of this mess, because absolutely nothing you do has any meaning, because none of this mess has any meaning. Life itself is will to power, it's just living beings discharging their strength on one another, and that's all it's ever going to be. It's just a cycle that will continue. And you know what? I have to hand it to the developers for having the gumption to go ahead and put a story like that into a video game, and no less a major video game like this. If nothing else, it means that this game is very unique. There is not really much else I can think of off the top of my head that is this overwhelmingly nihilistic in the gaming space. And I have to say kudos to the developers for following through on this idea even in the gameplay mechanics, with things like the constantly respawning guard posts, meaning that clearing out the guard posts is basically worthless. And they even commit to this with the endings, because there are actually 2 endings based on what you decide to do at the end, and regardless of what you choose, it doesn't really matter, because nothing is ultimately resolved. And again, I really have to hand it to the developers and the writers for sticking with that idea all the way to the end of the game, and really building the entire game around that premise. Because that was an incredibly bold thing to do, and it really does set Far Cry 2 apart from basically any other game out there. But there are 2 downsides to it. The first is that, frankly, the writing's just not very good, even though it is different. And the second is that it makes every single bit of enjoyment you could possibly have in this game fall to the gameplay mechanics themselves, which of course brings us to what the mechanics themselves are actually like and whether or not they hold up. So like I said before, this is a first-person shooter and it is open world, meaning you can basically go wherever you want to. There are 2 regions that you will be going to, the first of which is accessible right from the beginning, and the second one only after a certain point in the storyline, where after all of the action moves to that other province. Most of the jobs you'll be undertaking will be given to you by either the APR or the UFLL, and you'll be basically playing both sides of the conflict the entire time, and those objectives will range from things like taking out specific enemies to destroying certain things, or maybe even just delivering something to a specific location. Whenever you get a mission from one of the 2 main factions, your buddy will actually call you shortly after retrieving the mission details, and will tell you to meet up with them at a certain location and give you an alternate way of finishing the objective, and if you decide to do things their way and complete their objective, then afterwards you'll end up needing to meet up with them at a different point, and you'll end up having to fend off an attack wave. This of course leads me into the question of what are buddies anyway? It's a system that they implemented to give you companion characters, where you have two particular buddies, your best buddy and your second best buddy, who will assist you in different ways. The best buddy will give you those alternate mission objectives, and your second best buddy will come rescue you if you end up dying out in the field somewhere, at least as long as they've had their appropriate recharge. And the way you accomplish that is by going to a safe house and meeting up with them, which will put them into the rescue-ready state. And while we're on the subject, the safe houses are different buildings scattered around the world that will unlock once you've defeated all the enemies that are standing outside of it, and it will allow you to save your game in there as well as pass time by laying on a cot. And there's also different upgrades that you can unlock for the safe houses, like weapon crates, which will allow you to store weapons at either a safe house or a gun shop, and then you can pick it up from any safe house or gun shop anywhere else in the world. And they're not only the meeting points for where you'll meet up with your second best buddy and get them into rescue-ready state, but more often than not, they're also where you'll meet up with your best buddy in order to get the new objectives for whatever mission you're on. And if your buddies aren't on a mission with you, then they're going to be hanging out at one of the two bars in the game, one for each sector, and they can ask you for a favor, which will give you a new side mission to complete. There are also side missions available in certain other locations, most notably the radio towers and the gun shops. If the gun shop gives you a new mission to complete, then it's almost always going to be something where you just go off and destroy a convoy that is filled with apparently faulty weapons, and that will unlock new items for purchase at the weapon shops. And as for the radio towers, those are where you'll be able to get assassination missions where you're given a specific target you need to take down and you can just take it out however you wish. Whenever you take on one of the main missions or you complete one of the side missions, you'll get your payment. In the case of the weapon shop, you just get the unlock for the various weapons, but in the other cases, you will gain a number of diamonds. These are the in-game currency, and you spend it entirely on weapon and equipment upgrades. The weapons themselves are pretty self-explanatory, but you can also upgrade those weapons with accuracy and reliability upgrades, and you can also upgrade the various vehicles' reliability as well as give yourself additional ammo capacity and things like that. Next to every weapon shop in the game, there's also an armory where you can go over to refill all of your ammunition as well as all of your explosive and flame weapons, and you can also grab brand new versions of whatever weapons you have unlocked at any given point. There are technically 4 weapon slots, although one of them is always the machete no matter what, and the other ones are your primary, secondary, and special weapon slots. Primary weapons are things like assault rifles, sniper rifles, shotguns, etc., whereas the secondary weapons are primarily pistols, but you can also get things like an Uzi in there. The special weapon slot is something that you'll probably be swapping out depending on what you think you'll be encountering, because it can either be explosive launchers, or it can be light machine guns like a PKM, or it could even be a flamethrower. Although obviously with the flamethrower you have to be a bit careful because the flames spread so quickly and are so dangerous in this that you might actually end up getting caught in them yourself if you just are careless when you're using something like that. Aside from all of the main weaponry, you also have access to frag grenades and Molotovs, which are in the throwable slot, which has its own dedicated button, and there's another button that is used to toggle which one you're using at any given point. Molotovs are pretty weak on direct attacks, but they can set areas ablaze very quickly, whereas frag grenades are very effective in a short radius around the initial explosion, but they don't really have a whole lot of range to them. You can also run across various mounted machine guns or mounted grenade launchers that'll either be on vehicles or in certain defensive positions, and those have infinite ammo but do have a cooldown after a while. This is especially important if you get into an area with a lot of enemies because your ammo supplies are fairly limited unless you're playing on some of the lowest difficulty settings, and so you'll probably be running pretty low on ammo for many of the larger fights in the game. And while that's less of an issue with the sniper rifles just because they do a ton of damage, it is certainly a problem with the various assault rifles and submachine guns because enemies can be very damage spongy when you're shooting them in any location other than the head. And because the game has cone of fire mechanics, even if you're aiming down your sights, it means that you're not always going to be hitting what you're actually aiming at. This means that the game is pretty heavily balanced in favor of sniper rifles, because then you can take out enemies from a long distance away, usually with 1 or 2 shots, and because the inaccuracy on those guns is so minimal, you don't really need to worry about missing unless you just didn't line up your shot correctly. You are still going to need to worry about weapon reliability, however, because that affects every single gun that you're going to be using, and of course even the special weapons. As you continue to use various weapons, their condition will gradually degrade, and as it continues to degrade, you'll notice that it tends to get rustier and more blemished, and eventually the gun will start jamming on you. Clearing a jam is a pretty simple process where all you have to do is just press the reload key when the unjam option comes up, but you will have a brief few seconds where you're having to go through that animation of clearing the jam before you can use the gun again. Different weapons have different reliability ratings compared to others, so some of them are going to take longer to do that, and some of them are not going to take anywhere near as long in order to get to those conditions. Regardless of that, however, every single weapon that you pick up from a fallen enemy, or even a fallen buddy if they manage to die, is going to be very heavily degraded to the point where it's very close to the point where it's going to start jamming up on you. And if you're not careful and don't replace that weapon when you come across one in a better condition than it, then the weapon will actually break and become completely unusable, thus requiring you to go find a new one. Now, in theory, this adds a bit of realism to the game and also makes it a bit more tense during gunfights because you're worried that your weapon might jam on you. In practice, you almost have to go out of your way to get it to be a problem. As I mentioned before, every single weapon shop has an armory right next to it where you can go and collect any of the weapons that you have unlocked over the course of the game, and you'll just get a brand new version of whatever it is in prime condition. And even without the reliability upgrades, it actually takes quite a few shots to get it to a point where it's going to start jamming on you, so you're probably going to be fine for even a couple of missions before you need to replace your weapons, and by that point, you've probably come across a weapon shop anyway, and there's no reason not to stop in there and replenish all of your ammunition, replenish all of your surrettes, which are used to replenish your health, as well as just grab brand new versions of whatever weapons you were already using. This reduces the reliability system down from a fairly integral mechanic to something that's an absolute most a mild annoyance. What's considerably more integral to the gameplay, however, is the new healing system, which would be continued throughout the rest of the Far Cry series, where you have a health meter and it has a bunch of pips on it, and as you continue to take damage, that will gradually degrade until you get to the next pip, and your health only automatically regenerates up to the highest point of your current pips. So let's say you started out with 5 pips and you ended up going down to the 4th pip. Well, if you're still within that, then you can heal up to the maximum that the 4th pip has, but in order to get back up to the absolute maximum, then you either need to use a surrette or you can find a water bottle that will replenish a couple of pips. If you manage to take enough hits to get all the way down to the final pip on your health meter, it will start flashing red, and you'll have to go through a quick animation where you either pull out a bullet that's lodged in your body somewhere, or you just wrap up a wound, or whatever the case may be. And because you need to be stationary while you're doing this, even though it is a fairly brief animation, you're very vulnerable while doing so you need to be very careful with that. Once you've gone through that animation, it will fill up your health up to the 2nd pip, and then in order to get back up to maximum, you'll either need to use water bottles or surrettes. And while you have quite a few of these surrettes in your inventory and can heal yourself pretty often, and the game actually does have a pretty good supply of surrettes throughout the entire game world, enemies can do quite a lot of damage to you very quickly, especially on the higher difficulties, and that can lead to some very intense combat situations where you're trying desperately to stay in cover and heal yourself, while the enemy is pressuring your position by trying to throw grenades at you or trying to flank you, and they actually are very effective at doing this for a game from 2008. That's not to say that the enemy AI is particularly amazing, but it's definitely competent enough that it serves a challenge, particularly in areas where there's a lot of heavy vegetation and it makes it hard to see exactly where they are, even though they can see you just fine. The enemies can also be absolutely relentless on pursuing you, to the point where they will go out of their way to find a vehicle and try to chase you down even if you're in another vehicle trying to get away from them. To make matters worse in that regard, you can just be driving around minding your own business, and then all of a sudden an enemy patrol in a vehicle comes along and just immediately attacks you, chases you down, and causes you to stop and get out of the vehicle and go and deal with those guys before you go about your merry way. And while initially that might create some tension, once you've done that dozens and dozens of times, you just get completely sick of it, because those guys constantly respawn. and the guard posts constantly respawn, so you're having to constantly clear out the same areas you were just in a couple of minutes ago over and over and over again. And because half the time you end up getting in these combat encounters, you're going to be driving around, they're going to be shooting the living crap out of your vehicle, and that will cause your vehicle's condition to degrade, because the vehicles also have reliability, and you'll have to get out of the vehicle, go in front, or in back, depending on where the engine is, and you're going to have to go through an animation where you just use a socket wrench on it for a while, until eventually it gets back into a functioning order. While I think the intention there is to give a bit of realism in the sense that vehicles can break down as well, it's pretty ridiculous to have every single vehicle problem fixed with socket wrench. And unlike later Far Cry games where you can fast travel to most of the locations you visit, in this one you can only fast travel at certain points on the map, specifically bus stops, which are going to be somewhere in the four corners of the map that you're on, as well as somewhere in the center, which is going to be right next to the main settlement area. And with very, very few exceptions, most of your missions are not going to take place particularly close to wherever these bus stops are, so you're going to have to drive to those, and you're going to have to go through several guard posts to get to it. And while there are waterways you can traverse that might make things a bit quicker in certain instances, you're still going to be running into patrol boats on those, and you're also going to be running into guard posts on those, so you're not going to be able to avoid that loop there. And because there are no aerial vehicles, you're not going to be able to just fly wherever you want to go. So you end up having to either drive a boat or a car or a truck or whatever the case may be to wherever is nearby the mission location, complete the mission, get back in the vehicle, and go back the way you came. And that is ultimately the game's biggest problem, just how insanely tedious it is. Because I really don't think it's an exaggeration to say that roughly 60 to 70% of this game is just traversing the map to get to where you need to be. And the fact that you're constantly running into patrols that don't really pose a threat to you but are still very annoying, and you're constantly running through guard posts which may pose a threat to you but mostly just end up being a mild annoyance more than anything else, eventually adds up to the point where it becomes an absolute chore to play the game. And to make matters worse, there's also the malaria mechanic on top of that, because as I mentioned much earlier, your character contracts malaria at the beginning of the game and has to continually seek out medicine in order to avoid its ill effects. This effectively means that occasionally you'll be given an underground mission, which is in addition to whatever mission you were already on, and you'll have to go to a specific location, fight a bunch of mercs, and then just go into a building, hand off some papers, and then you get some medicine in return. The medicine itself will come into play roughly every half hour to 40 minutes of game time, where you'll suffer a malaria attack where the screen will get all yellow and blurry and play some obnoxious noise, and you'll have to hit the heal button in order to whip out your pill bottle, grab yourself an anti-malaria pill, and down it. Because that's just how malaria works, apparently. It's pretty ridiculous, and frankly, it only serves to annoy the living crap out of the player when it does happen. In fact, so much of this game goes out of its way to be either outright annoying or at the very least tedious and inconvenient that it makes you question what the developers were actually thinking. And it's at that point you will start to come to the realization that the developers actually did not intend for this game to be fun. What they were trying to go for is more emotional investment, where you actually feel the effects of maybe having to put down one of your buddies who has gone down to their last life, and you can't end up reviving them, so you just have to put them out of their misery. Or the overwhelmingly nihilistic narrative to where you go in there maybe with noble intentions, only to realize that you're no better than any of the other mercenaries that have basically taken control of the country and have turned it into an absolute hellhole. And while the developers' intentions in that regard are certainly interesting and frankly extremely bold, especially for a AAA game, unfortunately the developers just weren't up to the task. The characters are not anything remotely resembling interesting enough for you to really be able to care about them. The story is just something you can't really care about all that much, and that means that the gameplay is what you end up focusing on, and that's where you're ultimately going to lose the majority of people who are going to be trying to go into Far Cry 2, because most people just care about playing a fun video game, and Far Cry 2, frankly, is just not very fun. And while the question of whether or not a video game actually needs to be fun is a bit complicated and really depends entirely on what the game's setting out to achieve in the first place, in Far Cry 2's case, it's actually rather straightforward, because it does not achieve what it was ultimately trying to do. And because the writing and the characters are not up to the task of carrying everything forward, ultimately, that lack of fun becomes all the more glaring and really does tank the entire experience. The thing is, a lot of that is really only achieved through hindsight, because back when this game originally released, open world games weren't anywhere near as common as they are now, so we didn't really have very good formulas on how to do things like this. And of course, it was rather technically impressive for the time as well, so it was easy to overlook a lot of the game's issues in favor of the things that were new and different that it tried to do. But when you look back on that, knowing now that other games have tried similar ideas and actually done a better job of it, it's really impossible to ignore Far Cry 2's faults when trying to make a recommendation on whether or not you should first off buy it, and if you've already bought it, whether or not you should try to play it. And in that regard, I really can't recommend you pick it up and give it a try, because it is just such a difficult game to even attempt to enjoy, let alone to actually enjoy, because it's something that's not meant to be enjoyed. And how do you judge something like that? Well, in my case, you give it a 2 out of 5 and say that for a very specific subset of people out there who are willing to put up with the amount of crap that the game throws at you, well, you might be able to get something out of it. And the only other group I can see maybe giving the game a try and being able to get something out of it are people who are just interested in the history of the Far Cry series and don't really care whether or not the game is actually any good, because they just want to experience what it was like to play it. Because if you go into this looking for a fun open world game to play, well, it's a pretty terrible open world game because they hadn't really figured out how to do open worlds properly at the time, and so it's just full of a whole lot of nothing. And because of all the aforementioned issues that it has, even normal FPS fans are probably not going to be able to enjoy it either. As such, it really is the odd one out in the Far Cry series, and while it does attempt some interesting ideas, it just ultimately didn't succeed, and while it was certainly interesting to play it back when it first came out because everything was just so new and fresh at the time, in hindsight, it's just an absolute mess. Thank you all very much for watching, and if you like the kind of videos I make, then please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. Every single cent I get from that goes directly back into the channel in some regard, whether that be getting additional games for review, or additional equipment, or whatever the case may be. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that's perfectly fine, I understand, but the option is there if you're interested. Thank you all again for watching, and I'll see you all in later videos.